and welcome to Living Writers. I'm Jennifer Bryce, and today I'm speaking with my colleague C.J. Hauser, a fiction writer in the English department. We're talking about Friday Black, a story collection by Nana Adjei-Brenyah, who finished writing the stories in this collection during his fellowship year at Colgate in CJ's first year in the English department, 2016-17. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a book I'm really excited to talk about.
As you can see, we're both reading Galleys with a second cover on a book that doesn't actually come out from Houghton Mifflin until October, but it's available now for pre-order from Amazon and the Colgate bookstore. And it's gotten a couple of good reviews already from Publishers Weekly. It's been called a stingingly satirical collection of stories that tackle urgent instances of racism and cultural unrest and explore the many ways we fight for humanity in an unforgiving world. How does that description sit with you? And what else would you say by way of description?
I like that a lot. I think it's also funny, and I think it's confident or authoritative. There's something about the stories, each one of them in a different way, that feels like it sort of grabs the reader and insists upon the story being read on the author's own terms in sort of a new way you might not have come to it on your own, and that's something I really appreciated about it. It made me hurt and it made me laugh a lot throughout the pages.
Just to read a little bit more from a review, this one from Publishers Weekly, it says, Adjei-Brenyah has put readers on notice. His remarkable range, ingenious premises, and unflagging momentous voice make this a first-rate collection. I'm thinking, once again, these reviewers make the book sound very heavy and serious, and it is lighter than that.
It is lighter than that. I think that something doesn't need to be depressing and sad to be important, but I like the phrase "put you on notice." I think it's a book that announces itself, that announces Adjei-Brenyah as someone to look at and to someone to pay attention to in the future. Roxane Gay has tweeted a couple times that she read the book, and she keeps on saying that it messed her up good. And I feel like that's a good way of putting it, because it doesn't necessarily feel like a bad thing. It just feels like it had an effect on her, a strong effect, and I feel the same way.
Yeah, it knocks you sideways, this book.
Yes.
The voice, it is wonderful. You said you'd pick out a passage to read this afternoon.
And it's one of the more sort of realist passages, because there are many different kinds of style represented in the text, but this is kind of a subtler moment that I thought was really wonderful from the story, The Lion and the Spider. And we have this young character, his dad has been missing, and we have these reminiscences of his father, and he's working this sort of, sad sack job where he's unloading this truck. He's an unloading specialist again and again and again, and he talks about sort of how he gets through the day, and he says, "To make things easier, I played little games in my head. Like, I imagined that if we worked fast enough at the back of the truck, behind that final wall of washing machines and fridges, there would be something amazing. A bag of money, a baby, gold, anything. I'd choose something specific, though. If it was a baby, it would be a lost child with a name, Christy. We'd only know this because of the note left behind with her. I'd pull away a whirlpool, and there she would be, little baby Christy, a note tucked into the folds of the soft blanket she was wrapped in. Please take care. I know you are better suited than I am. Please, I love her, I love her, I love you, Christy, goodbye, I love you." The baby in the note would be obviously shocking discovery for the specialists, and for like 5 minutes we wouldn't know what to do. We'd take turns holding the baby, then almost sadly we'd call a manager and he'd call the police. Of course we'd stop working for the day. For years following me, Cato and Reese would all keep track of Christy. We'd be secret faraway fathers sending her anonymous little treasures, and she'd be known locally by some kind of nickname that fused baby words and home improvement stuff, tool-born tyke, or whatever. But then when we got to the very end, all that work ended in a tall slab of nothing, always.
Why choose that passage?
It just, when I read, I sometimes will do the incourtesy of dog-earing a page of the book if something really, really strikes me, and I did that with that passage. I think because it broke my heart so quietly, it's something about the fact that this is a scene of something that doesn't happen, but he wishes would, and I think a lot of these stories have to do with sort of the lives people wish they were living, or the worlds they wish they were living in, that they can't figure out how to make those better worlds exist, and they're sort of stuck with what they have instead. And so this fantasy of being heroes or doing something that matters, and then sort of giving that to us for a minute and then taking it away, I think is, I don't know, such a deft authorial turn there. What do you make of that passage?
It is really deft, and I was struck as you read it too by the fact that it's a flight of fancy in a story that is otherwise grounded in the reality. But it's a moment where Adjei-Brenyah lets this character sort of imagine some wildly improbable situation, whereas so many of the other stories do take place in a speculative world, that not science fiction. You teach, I know, science fiction and speculative writing. It might be worth sort of distinguishing between those two things.
Sure. I mean, I think that these aren't what Margaret Atwood got into trouble for calling flying squids in space sort of stories, science fiction stories. They are speculative fiction stories, which means they're very much like our world, but one or two details are just sort of, the dial is turned up on sort of, the intensity of something is turned up beyond the level of realism, or there's one element that's sort of different from our real world. So like in Friday Black, which gives us the title of the collection, it's about Black Friday at the mall, and it's basically just Black Friday at the mall, except for that the consumers are zombie-like and are speaking a language that's called Friday Black.
They're willing to kill each other for TV sets.
That too.
Whole fleece jackets.
Yes, fleece TM. But it's only sort of 1 degree separated from our world, and so that, in my mind, is what makes it speculative instead of sci-fi.
I'm struck in the opening story, the Finkelstein Five.
Yes,
Finkelstein Five, by how true he is to the details of this real world, so that when he gives the more speculative elements, such as a murderer, a white man who kills 5 black children outside a library by cutting their heads off with a chainsaw, he also says, and the level of detail here is amazing, he commits this crime. George Wilson Dunn, the triple-named George Wilson Dunn, commits this crime to protect himself, his library loan DVDs, and his children by going into the back of his Ford F-150 truck and retrieving his Hawtek PRO Pro 18-inch 48cc chainsaw. The level of detail, not just his pickup truck and not just his chainsaw, but there's a way of saying I've got these details right, so maybe it's not so wild. Right. That these kids have their heads cut off with a chainsaw?
And I think there's something about those details. I think you're absolutely right that it's cementing it in the real world. And this is a story that's obviously in dialogue with the George Zimmerman case, and then we can talk about Zimmerland later.
But very deliberately named, don't you think?
Yes, definitely. And I think here, I mean, the part of the story that's sort of ridiculous or unbelievable is sort of the scale of the atrocity that he murdered these children with a chainsaw. And yet, we get those details which continue to force us to consider the fact that this isn't so far away from our world, and it's basically what actually happened. It's just made so large as to make it more visible to us, the readers. And so I feel like that's what those details are doing there as well.
Let's talk about naming a little bit more. I know you have some interesting ideas about this. There's, of course, Zimmerland, which has to be an oblique reference to George Zimmerman, the murderer of Trayvon Martin, because Zimmerland is a theme park where people can go to play out their fantasies of, among other things, shooting up a school or
defending their home. I'll put that in scare quotes.
From us in the Finkelstein Five, the names of those children that get repeated over and over and over again. The name of the murderer gets repeated. The names, the brand names, as you mentioned from in retail and the Friday Black story.
Yeah, I feel like there's something about naming and power that runs through a lot of this collection. I think in the Finkelstein Five, I mean, the act that the activists are sort of forcing people to do is to say the names of the murdered children out loud, and people are refusing to do it, and they're called the namers, and the act is called the naming. And the idea is, like, just look at this thing and say that it happened, admit that it happened, and name it. And then in Finkelstein and Zimmerland, the fact that it keeps repeating over and over again and still no one can see what's wrong with it, I think that's sort of part of it. We're living in Zimmerland forever until we can get out. But there are other places where this sort of idea of being named or seen or acknowledged feels important. In Lightspitter, Porter is the character who the ghost of the school shooter and the girl he murdered, their two ghosts are going around trying to see if they can stop him from shooting people. And so much of what they're trying to do is get him to feel seen and acknowledged in such a way that he won't do it, or to understand that if he does do it, he won't be made famous and won't be sort of raised up as a known celebrity name, that he'll be nothing.
What's your take on his sense of character and character development?
I feel like so many of these characters are trying to understand like who's in charge, maybe, and I think that the absent parents have to do with that. There's this sense, I mean, this is a book that's asking a lot of big picture questions about the world and culture we live in now, about consumerism, about race, about violence, and I think that when you ask those sorts of big questions, those are generational questions in a way, and I think the absence or sort of abject failure of a lot of the parents in this book, in the case of the father who's sort of killing his own daughter every day in the last story, I think that speaks to the idea of maybe receiving no help from the previous generation, at least for these young protagonists. And I think they're characters who feel a lot of feelings but keep tamping them down. Even in that passage that I was reading from the story about the guy at the back of the truck, he deflects his own emotions by saying, for like 5 minutes, or we do this, or whatever, as if to even admit to feeling something genuine for a moment is the worst, and he has to sort of tamp it down afterwards.
He can't want anything.
No, he's not allowed to want anything.
A lot of these characters are not allowed to want, or their wants are very, very constrained.
Because what if they don't get it, and then they have to admit that they wanted it, and now they can't have it, which is worse than never wanting it in the first place.
So let's talk about stuff a little bit.
Yeah.
These stories for me divide into the ones that are about race, about technology, about runaway science and technology, the hold they have on our lives. But there are a handful of stories that are set in the mall.
Yes.
The prominent mall. I love, which is a great name for a mall. They arise, as we both know, from Nana's experience working in retail for many years in New Jersey before he went to college and then graduate school at Syracuse. What about stuff? What's he saying about consumerism here?
Honestly, I feel like the way I read a lot of it, it ties back into the same idea of being seen and noticed and sort of symbols of importance and status. Everyone who's trying to buy those bold-faced jackets seems like they want them not because they need to get warm. Like they want them because of what it means to buy them or to have this interaction in the store, or because it's Black Friday and this is the one day they can afford it. It's a gesture and a symbol of what you can be or be seen as, less than an actual thing. But I don't know, the mall as a space is interesting too. What did you make of Mall Story?
I liked them a lot. They're the stories that are set mainly in the store, and then there is the story in retail that's set just outside the store, where this woman is looking at the spot where another woman jumped to her death.
There's that first line, and I think it might sort of echo out over the larger collection actually. In retail, if you don't want to be a Lucy, you gotta find ways to make the bleak a little better. Lucy was that girl who jumped from the 4th floor last month on her lunch break. And that idea of how do you avoid becoming a Lucy, I feel like that's a question that you could think about in all of these stories.
There's a wonderful passage from an interview that Nana gave. He's thinking here about being a salesman. He said the key for me was sincerity. And then he says, he backs away from it a little, at least the projection of sincerity.
Oh man.
Projecting sincerity hundreds of times over an open to close is a special kind of torture because it forces you to pretend to be the exact opposite of what you feel 4 hours into any shift. Apathetic, and on bad days, homicidal or suicidal. It takes some method acting. You need something good on your mind so that your eyes will carry your smile when you walk up to the 96th person and say, "Hey, how you doing today? I think that jacket would look great on you." You need to try to be happy, even though if you're like me, almost everything about working in retail feels a little bit like depression.
That's so interesting. And I think it's interesting particularly because just in life, we both know Nana to be a person who, I know when he's doing the things he's passionate about. I'm thinking about when he was here reading for the Colgate Writers Conference just a couple weeks ago. He came to the student readings, the participant readings, just because he wanted to.
So great.
And he was the loudest clapper in that auditorium. And afterwards, he went up to every single writer and told them what he loved about their stories. And that wasn't phoning it in like in retail. That's something where people writing and reading and caring about it lights him up.
Yeah. It wasn't the projection of sincerity, it was sincerity.
So what activates that sort of real sincerity in a world where it often doesn't feel like very much can do that?
Pain and violence. There's a lot of both of those things in these stories.
Yes.
We've talked about the fact that Nana's a pretty lighthearted guy in his interactions with other people. In his teaching, we both have students who absolutely adore him. But these are violent stories. There's one that has a school shooting in it, and another one that features 2 aborted fetuses beating up on each other. That's one of the stranger stories in the collection. But there's a lot of death and pain and mayhem. People get trampled to death. Children nearly get trampled to death in the Friday Black story. What do you make of it? And how does he handle it?
I think a lot of the violence in the book feels cyclical to me, which I think is intentional. I think in the final story, in The Flash, the violence repeats. It's a sort of violent purge every day, and they keep living it and trying to see if they can become less violent over time.
Zimmerland, too, of course. The main character goes back to the theme park and gets beaten up or killed every day.
Every day he has to get shot. And I think that the idea that these things repeat, I mean, even Friday Black, this is sort of the 5th Friday Black sale that this guy has worked out where there's been this violent purge. The fact that these things keep repeating, and what do we do with that is a question that Adjei-Brenyah is asking. And I think that the Light Spitter story about the school shooter is one that sort of tries to answer that, as these 2 people try to figure out, is there a way to get this kid to not shoot up the school, to let the last shooter, who is now dead and a ghost, and his victim, somehow the 2 of them together convince this kid not to do the thing. And so I guess, I don't know, I think he exaggerates the violence to make sure we don't miss it. I think about Mary Shelley famously revised Frankenstein something like 3 times because she had sort of messages of violence and ignoring the suffering of the lower class that she felt no one was picking up on, and she kept on making it bigger and bigger and bigger in each revision to sort of be like, can you see it now?
Yeah,
and
I think of the chainsaw, taking children's heads off with a chainsaw. Okay, do you get it now?
I think he has made it so hyper exaggerated in an effort to be like, you can't not see this. You can't deny this is happening. And I think that's part of it too, maybe. I feel like the last story, Through the Flash, which I love so much, I think it might be my favorite in the collection, Amma, who had been the knife queen when the Flash started, murders everyone in her quad every day, over and over and over and over again, until she realizes that's wrong, and she stops. And then she's no longer the knife queen, she's Amma. But then there's this other person who she tortured, who is now sort of this villain, and he can't be saved because of the violence she passed on to him. And the story is about trying to sort of keep him from perpetuating that cycle. And the last image that we get in the collection is they vanquished Carl, what an unlikely name for a super violent person, but Carl, for the day. And we know he'll be back tomorrow, and they're gonna have to do this whole thing again, and it's gonna be violent and horrible. But they all decide that when the apocalypse comes, they're gonna stand in these dancer poses. And it says, even the apocalypse isn't the end. That you could only know when you're standing before a light so bright it obliterates you. And if you are alone, pose like a dancer. When it comes, you feel silly and scared. And if you are with your family, or anyone at all, when it comes, you feel silly and scared, but at least not alone. And it feels like this small gesture of, here's maybe the best we can do in the face of all these things that just keep coming and feel like the apocalypse day after day. And so, I don't know if that's redemption or consolation, but I really liked ending on that note.
Or even an Ars Poetica.
Yes.
Here I am, I'm talking to you, reader, and that makes me less lonely.
Me too.
Thanks so much for talking with me.
You as well.